Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance by voices within the independent Catholic movement. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. And now, meet your hosts, Reverend Dr. Trish Sullivan-Bonney and Reverend Dr. Jayme Matthias.
Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Father Jayme Matthias.
And I'm Reverend Trish Sullivan-Bonney.
And for this episode, we're excited to welcome a special guest, Reverend Trish.
Well, we have with us from across the sea, Kate McElwee, who is the director of the Women's Ordination Conference. And I imagine that so many of the people who are listening or watching our podcasts know the amazing fortitude of this organization through literally generations of women standing up and saying our dignity is no less than the men in the eyes of God. And we are no longer okay with 6 sacraments for women and 7 for men. And Kate has been, for me, a very inspiring leader. Kate, this is going to sound like corny, but a next-gen leader compared to the gals who were leading in my generation, or even the women ahead of me, some of whom I know, some of whom were in Chicago in the 70s doing the initial work. But Kate picked up the mantle of this organization with such passion and vision, and a wonderful cohort of women in her age group that were, again, willing to put a stake in the ground and say, we love this tradition. We cherish this tradition, and we will not act like the tradition is locked in an iceberg and cannot read the signs of the times in the light of the gospel. So Kate, so many of us, I'll speak for the women of our movement, but I bet you my brother Jayme and many of my priest friends who identify as male would say we're deeply grateful for the work that you do, for the work WAC does, for being that piece of sand in the oyster that will eventually produce the pearl. So can you tell us a little bit about you and your background, and how maybe a little bit about how you found WAC, how long have you been at it? Just introduce yourself to our wonderful people who are with us today.
Well, thank you so much for that generous introduction. I'm so happy to be here, and yeah, I'm excited for our conversation. It's so good to be in solidarity with one another. It really fills my heart. So yes, I was raised Catholic. I was also raised a feminist. And so for many years growing up, I was juggling questions of, how do I hold all my questions about my faith and my draw towards human rights and women's rights. And, over the years I tripped over some patriarchal stones in my upbringing in the Catholic Church. I wasn't allowed to be an altar server where I was growing up. I wasn't allowed to play basketball on the CYO team. They told me I should be a cheerleader, and I was like, no, thank you. And so I had a lot of training. And so I went to college as an undergrad, and I was like, I'm becoming a Buddhist. And so I did, actually. I studied Tibetan Buddhism in college and went down this path of exploration and discovery. And I went to India. I learned Tibetan. I met the Dalai Lama. And while I was there, I sort of kept hearing and smelling and feeling these things that were very familiar to me, which were the signs and the well-worn path of patriarchy. And I was like, oh, wait a minute, hold on a second. And so I came back to my own tradition in my final years at school and really looked at the Catholic and Christian faith, took feminist theology, and I had a moment of encounter at my women's college in Massachusetts when Mary Hunt came to our class. And I got to ask her the question that everyone asks me, why are you still a Catholic? And she said at that time, this is what a Catholic looks like, and we have a responsibility to speak this language. And so I really held that in my heart for many years. I continued to study Buddhism and also wrestle with my own faith. But I really, after many years, I got a master's degree in human rights law. I came back and sort of, there was a job listing for the Women's Ordination Conference. And so I was like, wait a minute, this is like my desire to explore spiritual activism, my big faith question about the Catholic Church, and then my big women's issues that I'm so passionate about. And so I applied for this job, which is more than 15 years ago now. And at the time, my mom was like, "So you're a Catholic again?" And I was like, "Oh, mom, of course, yeah, of course. Once a Catholic, always a Catholic, no problem." And so I got the job, and I didn't realize at the time really how far in the back door I was coming back into the church from, because it was, it is still so taboo, this question of women's ordination. But through my work with the Women's Ordination Conference, I got to really understand my faith, encounter so many people with sincere vocations and who are offering the ministry that the people of God need today. And it's really how I get to live out my faith and answer these questions of what is activism, what does spiritual activism look like, and use my voice in a very authentic way. And so I feel very lucky that my job holds all of these passions, and I get to explore and live into my faith, be a creative and thoughtful and effective activist, and encounter what I think is the best of the Catholic Church, which is the women on the prophetic edge, living out their call or holding or speaking prophetically about their ministry. So that's sort of where I am now.
Kate, what an absolute delight to have you with us today. You were with us for our inclusive Catholic summer school some few years ago, so many of us have fond memories of you and various sisters accompanying us during that experience. I just really appreciate your sharing these stories as one who is excluded from being an altar server, as one who is excluded from your CYO basketball team and told you were to be a cheerleader because of various gender stereotypes. I'm interested to hear from you and from Reverend Trish about the awakening in your experience, especially in the women that you speak with. It just seems that everyone has their own story, and that's what I love about this is these stories of awakening, and how it is that we just come to realize this, that we come to this sense often at an early age of how it is that various people are excluded from the ordained ministries of the Roman Catholic Church, and that this is not just a policy issue, but it becomes during this time of awakening a sort of matter of justice. And it really becomes real for our sisters rather than something just theoretical. I come to this conversation slightly differently as one who was, because of the biology into which I was born, was welcomed in the ordained ministries of the church, but it pains my heart. It just weighs so heavily on me that so many of our sisters who are so absolutely gifted have been excluded. And I'll share one story. My friend Heidi, who went on to earn her doctorate in systematic theology from Marquette University, when she studied with us at the Washington Theological Union, we studied the theology of the presbyterate, and in a class of 17 people, I looked around the room and said, if there's anyone in this classroom who should be ordained, it's not the seminarian who says, give me a B and let me free. It's her. It's the one woman who far exceeded any of the rest of us in that class of the theology of the presbyterate. And just to know that for the last 3/4 of our church's history that we've excluded such voices pains me. But it just heartens me to hear these stories of awakening. I'm wondering if you, Kate, and Reverend Trish might be able to help to open up the eyes and the hearts of our listeners to some of those stories, and what it means, for women who come to this sense of, this is a matter of justice, sacramental justice. And this is real. This is not just something theoretical. It affects real people.
Yeah, I'm fortunate to be able to have heard so many of these stories of women's aha moments about women's ordination, or when they first encountered a barrier. And often it's, a priest saying, is anyone interested in being an altar server? All the boys go over here and the girls stay here. There's a lot of stories like that. So many of them often include an encounter with another person in their faith community who sees something in a person, or sees a light, or sees a question that is yet to be answered. And so I think that's sort of there's a feminist tradition in that as well, but often it's someone around you who says, I see you asking questions. Let's walk through that. Let's live into that together. Let's pray with it together. So I think that tradition has one that comes up over and over again. And unfortunately, so many people don't encounter radical nun or that cool feminist theologian in the back pew. Like a lot of people fall through the cracks and end up not encountering having that moment of support, unfortunately. But so many do get to at least have someone see something in them, see that question in them.
Yeah, Kate, I appreciate that. And before I hand it back to Reverend Trish, I'll just share one more story that here at Holy Family Catholic Church, at Austin's only inclusive Catholic community, where we enjoyed the services of Mother Annie of the Association of Roman Catholic Women Priests, and where we enjoy the ministry of Deacon Elsa, there was a real heartening experience that I had a few months ago when a mother said to me, "What I love about this community is that my kids can come here and all of them can imagine participating in the ministries of the church, even my daughters." And there's just something so absolutely beautiful about that. Reverend Trish, what's moving on your heart?
Well, I am, that's so true, Jayme, but I've also come to realize that it's equally important for our sons. That as Kate, you mentioned Kate, going off and, being in the mountains and learning Tibetan. I just love that story. And this whole globe is gripped by patriarchy. And so many systems are gripped by patriarchy. Roman Catholicism does not have a corner on it in any way, shape, or form. And that was kind of a big aha for me. I was leading a workshop called Making a Difference, a Course for Those Who Minister in the 90s. And it was held at a Jesuit retreat house out on Staten Island. And that one gathering was for women clergy. So we had 30 women, about 26 clergy, a couple of lay ecclesial ministers who were my buddies from the Roman Catholic world. I was still very embedded in the Roman Catholic world, and a gay rabbi who had argued that in his world, as a conservative rabbi, he belonged with the women. And actually, he was right. But anyway, listening to them tell the stories of what they were up against in these patriarchal cultures was so humbling to me. Because I had this simple formula like, okay, well, we'll get ordination and then we'll get it. But in fact, these women had been part of that wave of ordination in the Episcopal Church, the Lutheran Church, the Presbyterian Church, and they were up against the grip of patriarchy. So it's the challenge of what you're doing, what I'm doing, what Jayme's doing is that it's a multivalent action, right? It's not as simple as open the door. In fact, I kind of always feel a little vaguely embarrassed putting on clerics for this podcast, but I'm very aware of the optics that like people might dial in and say, "Oh, that's the priest there," and then the woman in the turtleneck, that's, sister, which is how I was greeted as a chaplain over and over again, right? Because even this is part of our issue. Even this is part of how do we recreate, rethink, reanimate ordained ministry in a way that is not about power, control, and patriarchy and status and the symbols. I had always limited myself to wearing a collar when I was out in doing justice action, simply because then I could say, well, I'm witnessing on behalf of my whole community, not just me. Um, okay, that was kind of my little sidebar there. What else do we want to say? Jayme, you have another question? I mean, I'm thinking about my own journey to answer your original question. If I might go on a little bit more, Daniel, you can always edit me out. Um, because of my experience in that retreat house, I actually actively made a decision not to engage the question of ordination. I was a Job. I was like, don't tell me, fellow community members, that when you preach, we're so moved and inspired and we think you have the gifts to be a preach. Don't tell me that your teaching and leading in this community looks like priestly ministry. Don't tell me all of that because it's only a path of pain. And I watched it when I was in seminary that my women friends who were really engaging that question were in a lot of pain because they were incredibly gifted. We had the first all-female preaching class at St. John's Seminary and School of Theology in Collegeville with 6 women. And the priest who taught it was one of the, Father William Skudlark was one of the authors of Fulfilled in Your Hearing. He had never had a class with even one woman, never mind a class that had 6 women and no men. And in that class, I just saw the deep pain of the women who really were already present, how authentically called they were, by God. My solution was, I'm going to be like Jonah. I said Job. I should have said Jonah. I'm going to be like Jonah. I'm going to put my head down. I'm going to pretend that, there is no Nineveh, there is no Tyre. Don't send me there. And my life's unfolding kind of took me up and carried me to the point where I was ready to really deeply engage that question. So some of us are open and willing and aware, and other of us are like, I don't want to go there. And other of us never really have that deep feeling within ourselves. And because of the patriarchy, haven't had enough, as you say, Kate, enough voices saying, I see you. I see who you are. I see what's possible through you in God's plan. So back to you, Jayme.
Kate, I really appreciate your sharing of your faith journey. What a marvelous story of being raised Catholic and then being drawn to Tibetan traditions and then coming back to the Catholic faith and now your involvement and your leadership within the Women's Ordination Conference. My question has to do with your own faith journey and how it is especially that it has evolved during your leadership of the Women's Ordination Conference. That is to say, I'm really interested in, and I'm imagining our listeners are interested too, in what keeps you rooted in our Catholic tradition, even as you and so many of our sisters challenge some of its most entrenched teachings.
Honestly, it's a really difficult path because in many ways I'm a public figure of a movement and I have to I've been arrested at the Vatican, I've stopped traffic in the streets of Rome. I have to like suddenly be the person who's shouting out the street and confronting the police I have to like flip a switch in some moments to be that to that and so I think what really keeps me grounded and while I do benefit from our own liturgies and inclusive prayers that we offer at the Women's Ordination Conference, it's having a sort of interior faith life that feels a little bit separate from my work, which means like finding a community where I can just be Kate and not be the executive director who at any moment is going to start a protest. I have to feed myself in a way that I can just be just a simple person in the pew and kind of you have to find the right place where you can do this, but sort of suspend my I can just relax. I can just show up and just be a person, and that's sort of what has helped me feel balance because it is challenging to be that person. I'm people think of me as sort of shy, like I'm soft spoken and you have to sort of decide to take that risk in a moment and often like that those guts that come out like that is the in the moment I'm like okay I do this now I have to really really take a leap sometimes to do that but to feel like fed and whole certainly I participate in all of our liturgies that we do but when you're and you all know this when you're behind the scenes adding people, muting people, making sure everything's flowing. Sometimes you can't fully participate. So we do have a really welcoming community here in Rome. That's an English-speaking sort of Jesuit ministry that I'm part of, and in that space, everyone knows what I do, and we can talk about it after Mass. They have prosecco after church, so that's their little fellowship hour, which I recommend. That I get to be Kate, and that's like an essential part of my balance to be able to feel like I can be that front runner, I can be the vanguard, but I can also be just a person just receiving the gifts.
That's so awesome, Kate, that you have that kind of welcoming, loving community. And the truth is that even in the late 90s, the data was in
Yeah.
that there was no issue among the faithful about married clergy and women clergy. I mean, I remember when Cara did their data in the late 90s and Pew did data, and it was like the people are there. It's the institution that is struggling. And I also really love your describing taking care of your own spiritual life because years ago, one of the things I learned from I kind of think of Richard Rohr as one of my teachers, my spiritual teachers, that if your activism is coming from fury and rage, it has a different valence than when your action is coming from like a really deep conviction about God and who you are and what the world is and what's possible for the world. I'm thinking about the fact that in recent years, with the synod, with other things that have been going on, we've had a lot more visibility around this question. I mean, I think about samurais like Phyllis Zagano, who, I mean, for decades has documented the truth about women in the diaconate. I mean, the historical record is the historical record, people, and has hung in there. But now, seeing more and more education of the faithful, understanding what the historical record is, and maybe a little less, a cohort that's a little less quick to just take the Vatican edicts that, oh no, we can't have that. So I'm wondering if you could tell us two things. One, I'd love to hear what's the flavor of walk nowadays. I haven't been connected to walk as a member for many years because I took a different path. Maybe I should be renewing my membership. And you know, what's your sense of what the composition of walk is like, and what's your sense of the Roman Catholic community in terms of this question and the issues?
Yeah, it's a really interesting. I mean, the Women's Ordination Conference has been around for 50 years. And so we have gone through all the different sort of waves of feminism and waves of church scandal. And when I became a leader in the Women's Ordination Conference, I was really committed to dialogue, creating a ministry around dialogue. So attempting to dialogue with patriarchy, even though that can feel fruitless and for so many years it truly was. There was no crack in the door. A commitment to dialogue and a commitment to being smart activists. And so showing up in effective ways. And so actually living and being based in Rome, I've been able to sort of read the rhythms of the city and the institution in a way. So I feel like I have a better understanding of where to stand at what time for the greatest visibility for a real change. So for example, one of our big successes in the past few years has been our campaign for votes for Catholic women at the Synod. And I love this story because it shares, I think, what the flavor of walk is today. So in 2015 or so, we launched this campaign called Votes for Catholic Women. And one other person and I stood in St. Peter's Square and held up a sign that said, "Want to throw a better synod, invite more women, or ordain women or stop voting without them." And we were just two people. We were detained by the Vatican security, but two people. And then a few years later, the Vatican kept changing, moving the goalposts around who could vote at synods. And so suddenly there was a non-ordained brother who was allowed to vote at a synod. And so we decided to show up with our international partners without signs, without slogans, without just women's bodies at the gate of where the bishops will be walking into this room, making decisions, having conversations without, more than half the church. And we stood outside and used our voice and our presence, which is one of the most powerful things we have, the tools we have. And we called out the names of the bishops as they walked in. And we used this chant, "Knock, knock, who's there? More than half the church," over and over again. And I had prepped everyone. I'm like, we probably won't be able to be there very long, but we kept going. I'm like, okay, repeat it again, because we had been there for 10 minutes and then 20 minutes. And then someone made a phone call and an undercover police officer came and grabbed my arm. Someone took a picture of it. So that photo went around, but he grabbed my arm and he kept shouting at me like, "Silence, silence, silence." And I had that moment of like, oh, should I listen to this man? He's seems serious, and then I realized like, no, like this is why we're here. And so we kept doing our chant, "Knock, knock, who's there? More than half the church." And what I love about that moment is that they thought they could pluck the leader and that everything would dissipate. But actually, we are a true grassroots movement. And I was surrounded quickly by a spiral of women activists who then, the guys holding my hand, the police officers holding my arm, and all these people, the women surround me. And we keep shouting. And so that moment, that like risk of putting one's body on the line, showing up at the right place at the right time with a clear message, leveraging the media, and then that changed the conversation for the rest of the synod. And so at every press conference throughout the synod, that question of shouldn't women, why aren't women? And then quickly in Vatican years, quickly that conversation became mainstream. And so, as you all know, the end of the story, that women have voted at the synods at the Vatican. And it was only a matter of a few years. So after that flashpoint moment in front of the Vatican, we launched a petition and we got people involved and more collaboration. And so I think that just like shares, it's like the best of what walk is today, is that we're willing to be smart activists at the right time. We're willing to be courageous and take great risk. And then we know that we can't do it alone and that we need a grassroots movement to support us. We're very effective at using the media because, often we're a handful of people in Rome, but we represent, as you said, Trish, we represent so many other people when we show up. So leveraging that, getting the media involved, and then just being persistent over and over again, and willing to dialogue. In our years, I think back and I read our archives in the 80s. Walk was not looking to make friends. We would go into our room and have our mission and walk out. And so I think trying to be a little bit more a posture towards encounter, a posture towards listening, but being willing to do that with integrity, showing up where we need to be and making our voices heard. So that's sort of the flavor of walk, or what I hope is the flavor of walk today.
Kate, I absolutely love hearing these stories that you and Reverend Trish are sharing, and they bring to mind another story. When I was assigned as a young deacon here to Cristo Rey Catholic Church, a Roman Catholic parish here in Austin, that was in 2000, the Roman Catholic bishop at that time, John McCarthy, used to love telling the story of when John Paul II came to San Antonio in the 1980s. And according to Bishop McCarthy and the way that he told the story, he said that all the bishops of Texas were assembled with the Pope for lunch before whatever event they had in the afternoon that day. And Bishop John McCarthy decided to poke the bear. During lunch, he said, "Your Holiness, here in these United States, we've been talking about the possibility of ordaining women." And then after an uncomfortable silence, John Paul II replied, these mashed potatoes are delicious," or something to that effect, essentially signaling that there would be no conversation during this luncheon on that topic. And it just, for me, that really symbolizes sort of the Roman Catholic stance for many years on this issue, because many critics often argue that the question of women's ordination is settled doctrine. In fact, John Paul II in 1994 wrote that apostolic letter, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, which essentially said, we will not talk about this. And yet, Kate, you and so many of our sisters and brothers and others in ministry are talking about it. So maybe if you could just pull back the curtain and you and Reverend Trish and sort of like help us to know what it is that gives you the courage and what it is that you need to continue talking about something that for many people in many people's minds is we don't need to talk about it. Sort of like in the movie Encanto, right? We don't talk about Bruno, no, right? For some people, we don't talk about women's ordination, no, and yet y'all continue to help to raise the conversation for all of us who are involved. Any insights into what it is that inspires that and/or the theology to which you appeal? There's just so many rich stories of Jesus and his relationship to women that I think that they could provide a lot of insight into this tradition. So for those who say, we don't talk about Bruno, no, with respect to this issue, how do you and so many others, how do you respond? Is this settled doctrine?
Trish, I want to hear what you have to say. Recently, Mary McAleese, former president of Ireland, endorsed our 50th anniversary conference, and she doesn't mince words, and she just said, "They are wrong and you are right. Keep going." And so often we can talk about their arguments against it, but when you have the testimony and sincere discernment of women who experience and are called by God to serve in ordained ministry, there is no argument anymore. Women are called by God, and that to me that settles any debate. So I think there's a lot in the past few years, and in Pope Francis's pontificate, there was an opportunity for more free dialogue and conversation through the Synod on Synodality, and that really invigorated greater boldness around conversations with women's ordination. And we at Walk we cataloged and and kept track of any diocesan report or any continental report or country report, any report that mentioned the question of women's ordination. And it came up over and over again. And so to sort of say that it's over, it's clearly not a settled question because Joan Chittister once said something to the effect of that, if a question that involves half the human race, there has not been a satisfactory answer on this because the gospel demands it. And so we know that we're on the right side of history, and we just continue to create spaces for women to share their stories, because if we believe in an omnipotent God, then nothing is impossible with God, and there's living proof of that.
I love that, Kate. And you know, do you remember that billboard campaign that said God still speaks? You know, are we a dead letter? Is the Roman Catholic Church a dead letter that's just, cemented so solid that God can no longer move God's people? I mean, really, is that the church we believe in? I don't think anybody who's read the documents of Vatican II would say that. The Spirit of God is breathed on the church, and the church is called to constantly look out into the world and renew itself, reading the signs of the times. And, so as someone who does ecclesiology, I find this to be quite an affront that there are a number of issues that we are resisting engaging meaningfully with science, with contemporary understanding of the human person, with the listening to the people of God and what they're saying about their needs. Like all of those things as a convergence are, and you heard it here first, a sin. We're in Lent. It's sinful for us to turn our back on God's people as they're speaking about their needs, their longings, and to deprive them of the beauty of the complexity of human interpretation and leadership that comes when an office as critical as the presbyterate is open to women, because it's not even just your Sunday Mass. It's the way that role is embedded in systems of power so that women can't participate meaningfully in a lot of different roles in leadership. So I did my MDiv, and I graduated in 2005. And at the time, the roles that were open to me as a very well-educated woman, I had a Jesuit undergraduate education, so I'm glad you're at a Jesuit church, and where I could be a parish administrator, I could be a pastoral care person, and I could be a religious educator. That was pretty much, in terms of parish life, which is where I really felt profoundly called, what was going to be appropriate for me. And at the same time, I watched around this diocese my sisters who were equally well equipped, even in those roles, struggling around being allowed to really bring forth their wisdom, their equipping, whatever, in parish systems. That's what drove me to Berkeley to get a PhD, because I thought this is a, we talked WALK was the first group that talked about the stained glass ceiling, right? And I thought I can't be who I know I'm called to be without more equipping, because one thing I noticed is that women with terminal degrees were being taken the most seriously, right? So to ignore the historical record and to ignore God's people, I just think part of the reason the issue won't go away is they've never made a good case for why it should. That it never lands. So one of the things I'm curious about, and I'm an Irish citizen as well as an American citizen, and I follow the news in Ireland pretty regularly. And I'm very struck by where the Irish have gotten to, including the Irish bishops, around the issue of ordaining married men and including women in the diaconate. So I'm wondering about WALK's relationship with the hierarchy. What are you seeing with the hierarchy here in the U.S., which is a conservative episcopate, definitely way more conservative than a lot of other parts of the country, although I think most people in the pews don't realize that. Slowly moving, slowly changing, thanks to Francis and now Leo. We have the saints of God in my mind, like Cardinal Supich, speaking out on behalf of issues that should be a no-brainer and they should be in solidarity, but like, let's not lock up babies, things like that. Um, what is your relationship with the institution? Because in the 90s, well, really in the early 2000s, I was part of a number of underground meetings with bishops. And we were trying to see, could we I was leading a national ministry, and there were people from CORE, the Catholic organizations for renewal, getting together underground, inviting people from the hierarchy, having conversations. Bob Kaiser, who was the documentarian of the Council for Time Magazine, convened a gathering in Arizona with all of these, and again, it was all very secret. We can't let anybody know. We're sitting together and we're talking. What's the flavor now? Is it still that? Are they talking to you guys? Are they just saying, nope, can't go there? I'd love to know.
I mean, I don't think we'll ever be back to the heyday of those secret meetings and those relationships. In our archives, there's record of women's ordination advocates being invited to the bishops' conference meetings to share their vocation stories on the floor of their meetings. The Women's Ordination Conference was heavily involved in the pastoral letter on women, the drafting of that eventually got scrapped and not published by the U.S. Bishops' Conference, and that was what WAC wanted at the time, but they were in very deep consultation with the bishops in the early years. More recently, we launched a campaign called the Cardboard Cardinal. So a great dialogue partner who is sort of a cardboard cutout of a cardinal, because they're just as good as the real thing that we have. Not very talkative, a little stiff. So we did have that campaign, but we do actually have some relationships with bishops and cardinals today, and we do practice sort of sharing information as much as possible. Often we don't get a reply. Some of the kind of usual suspects or people you might suspect would be in conversation with us have been in dialogue with us in a non-public way, I would say. But it's certainly a shame that they don't seek out the members of the Women's Ordination Conference in a serious way, because they are part of their diocese, their church, and it is an emerging and the justice issue of our time. And so, yeah, it could be better, I would say. But certainly we have some relationships with cardinals and bishops, and I think in the U.S. it's challenging. But we do just I think last week Cardinal Hollerich was from Luxembourg was quoted saying, that the church cannot continue if it doesn't ordain women. So like we are seeing these sparks come up from especially across Europe. Of this conversation is not over, and it's getting into the hearts and minds of the clergy as well. But certainly there's a lot of room for growth with our relationship with the hierarchy. They know who we are, we know who they are. But certainly we would both benefit from greater collaboration together.
Kate, that just makes my heart heavy hearing that we may never be back to the heyday of those conversations that we've once had with members of the hierarchy. But since you mentioned relationships with bishops and with cardinals, I just have to ask, and you can politely defer if you'd like. But here in the United States, we have this fantastic thing that we're seeing with the first ever US-born Pope leading the Roman Catholic Church. And of course, we know that he has to walk a fine line to be able to hold together a church of over 1 billion people. But at the same time, are there any cracks, any light that's being let in that might lead us to believe that the Spirit could be working in some way other than just shutting down conversations?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm a hopeful person by default. I always say like hope is my superpower. They can never take it away from me. I think my doubt around the US is about the US bishops. I do think that the conversation is shifting, and that we will arrive to that moment where there is greater collaboration. But Pope Leo presents a very unique opportunity for dialogue and for conversation. He was educated alongside lay people at CTU. And at that time, we know that the Women's Ordination Conference was very active in Chicago. And we believe that he was probably at a mass where a Women's Ordination Conference protest happened at a diaconal ordination. So it's in his psyche and in his education that women are walking this educational and ministerial path alongside their brothers. And so I think that there's a lot of possibility and opportunity. And just in, it's almost been a year of his pontificate. And so we still have a lot to learn about Pope Leo. And I think he's learning his where his muscle and voice is best used as Pope. Um, but certainly I think he's in his ministerial experience more open to the pastoral realities or more aware of the pastoral realities around the world, that women are leading parishes on the ground, are leading communities in diaconal and priestly roles. So I think that he's Pope, but I think he does understand the realities in a way that maybe Pope Francis was closed off to, or wasn't open to that conversation. I think from what we've seen, Leo is a pretty cautious leader. So he may take his time, but I do think that he seems a little bit more, his posture seems like he should understand the call at this moment. And so, yeah, we hope that we can have that encounter and meeting and conversation with him.
Yeah, the global church is a very complicated organization. And Jayme, in a talk that he gives, likes to compare it to like a super tanker. You don't turn that on a dime. He likes to think that we're all on our jet skis, which I think is I want a jet ski for the summer, Jayme. I want to talk about the international situation a little bit, and your perspective, because one of the ways I think American Catholics have been suppressed is to say, well, that's great, all well and good that, we would want you people would accept this, but the African church would never accept it. The South American church would never accept it. That's a big trope. And I remember going to an event hosted by the Roman Catholic women priests in Berkeley when I was there studying with my to support my best friend, who is a African woman religious theologian now in teaching. And they invited her to be on the panel because they were convinced she was going to tell them all the reasons this would not work in her context. And then she proceeded, when her time was to share, to talk about women in the home in her culture in a West African country where the women's job was to keep the altar. And talking about any time she was coming home, her mother slaughtering and offering a chicken as an act of gratitude to God for her safe return. And at the very end, my friend said, if women's ordination is the future, sign me up. And I think there's a real misunderstanding, like this is the US issue, right? Or this is the issue in the European countries. I'd love to hear what you're seeing in terms of your global other organizational partners and what you know from being on the ground with this issue in terms of, the situation in the global church.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to talk to women around the world, and through networks like the Women's Ordination Worldwide, which is an umbrella group of other national groups that work for women's ordination, and a newer convergence called Catholic Women's Council, which has over 60 members across all over the world and deeply in Africa and Asia as well, and Latin America. Um, Women are longing for the same things, I think, which is equality, which is dignity. Um, they may use different words to say it, and the word ordination may not be the word that they would use to describe what they're looking for in their faith community or in their society. But I think it's you see that tradition gets leveraged to say, oh, in Africa it's the tradition. I think it's such a misguided argument and completely outside of the reality. There's so many incredible voices, especially from Africa today, coming out, the first and second generations of women theologians coming out. Father Orobator, a Jesuit priest who was the provincial for all of Africa, was an active participant in the Synod on Synodality, and he used his voice so prophetically to talk about the role of women in the Catholic Church. And the question about women deacons kept coming back. And they kept saying it's not ripe, it's not ripe. And in his incredible slow, like deep, slow voice said, like, what do you, when I look at a piece of fruit, I know what I'm looking for what makes it ripe. Like, what are you looking for? When will we know that this is like, and he just had such a pastoral way to raise up this question. So it's a complete misunderstanding of the global church to dismiss the voices, or to only focus on those who are well financed, who can take great risks to speak out, who are able to travel more freely. Those are the people who you see raising their voices in the media, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an incredible grassroots network of people who, for whatever reason, can't raise their voice on an international stage. But we are very much aware of them, and trying to collaborate as much as possible.
Kate, I love that we're speaking so internationally and globally here. If we were to draw the conversation to the life of individual concrete women who feel called to ordained ministry today, perhaps paraphrasing Hamlet, the question might be, to be ordained or not to be ordained? That is the question. And I'm wondering if you and or others, particularly within the Women's Ordination Conference, have any wisdom or perspective that you might share with young Catholic women who feel that call to ordained ministry, who know that there are ways in this world in which they could seek ordination from persons who possess valid lines of apostolic succession from Roman Catholic bishops. Is this something that we encourage and or not? Y'all are focused on systemic change, but I'm wondering, what does that mean for the concrete lives of women who are wrestling with this question today? And I'm imagining, even as executive director of the Women's Ordination Conference, there may have been a moment in your journey when you looked in the mirror and asked yourself, should I be seeking ordination to the church's ministries? Any reflections on what it is that all of this means for young women today who are discerning the Spirit's promptings, the Spirit's movement in their own lives?
It's a really important question. And as much as we are activists pursuing the ministry of irritation, one of our other ministries at the Women's Ordination Conference is what we call the Ministry of Walking with Women Called. And it can carry a lot of grief and pain, Trish, as you talked about earlier, but also, the joy of finding others who can affirm their call. So we offer, in the past few years, we offer a scholarship for people experiencing or discerning vocation to, or discerning ordination into in discerning ordained ministry. And so through that scholarship, we get to read a lot of testimonies and a lot of stories of especially young students and women and non-binary people discerning their career path and their vocational path. And those realities are often difficult to reconcile, especially for women, knowing that there is a stained glass ceiling if they pursue certain routes. And then there's huge financial risks, financial instability, uncertainty to following a path of ordination with an independent Catholic or an RCWP path. That it's not a path that everyone can sustain financially, as much as it feels like the thing they must do. And so it's a real tension. And a few years ago, my colleague Katie and I received a Louisville grant to study young Catholic women under 40, and we asked a lot of these questions, and it was surprising to us how few people were indicated that they were interested in pursuing ordination through independent movements, and for a myriad of reasons. But it seemed like there was a real balance of, I have to think about my career or my student loans after I've got my PhD or got my MDiv, and then my family life and my career. So there were a lot of realities that were felt like barriers to fully answer a call through ordination. And so I don't have an answer for that. I just know that for young women that we have been talking to in the past few years, they're very practical. as much as they will say loudly and proudly that they're called to priesthood or the diaconate or whatever, the reality of pursuing that path, it feels sometimes too difficult at this point in their life. That doesn't mean that they don't eventually do it, but it does, it is a complex reality for many women.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that one of the things in our movement that, maybe our brothers don't always understand is how risky it's been for so many of us to do what we do. And it is a sort of privileged role right now because it's really, you either have to be a worker priest as a woman priest and have another job and then have a certain amount of time you're spending with your community on the weekend, or you have to be in a position where, through whatever way you construct it, you have the freedom to be without income. Because we're in an era where it's really hard to build churches, right? It's very slow and very involved. And I'm just wondering what your message would be to the women in our movement. I think we'll just focus on the women. Um, I like to call the Roman Catholic Church our family of origin. And I have a beautiful relationship with my local Roman Catholic community. I raised my family there. They called me into a preaching ministry, preached there for years. I became who I am in the love and embrace of that community, and I will love that community till I die. I am who I am because of Pax Christi Catholic community, no question. I have no hesitation to go in and sit in prayer with that community. I'm very lucky. A lot of people have had a much more punitive experience than I have had. But there's a way in which I think a lot of people kind of feel like that the only way we can do this is we have to kind of shut the door on Roman Catholic and really stand in our independence, that we're like micro denominations. We shouldn't have anything to say about the Roman Catholic Church any more than my colleague Ashley, who's right across the hall in this church, who's an ELCA ordained. We're nested in a Lutheran church, any more than Ashley would have something to say. And yet, that's our family. That's where our roots come from. So I think there is some kind of tension. I know the ECC is the only jurisdiction that maintains threads to the Roman Catholic renewal groups. We're still members of CORE, but we're the only group that's maintained some sort of structural connection. And I'm wondering what you would say to all of, I know the Roman Catholic women priests are in completely with WAC, but what would you say to all of these, you know, 100 or so women who are out there like me in terms of what kind of relationship should we be having with WAC? Like what could we be doing to support people like you in your ministry?
Thank you for that invitation. I think there's such a loss of your stories when you leave and close the door. Like I think the women who have decided to leave the Roman Catholic Church for ordination in another line have such an important story to tell. And we don't get an exit interview often. Like your communities obviously hear your path and will know your story, but it would benefit the church so much to hear those stories of that point of decision, of that point of pain, that is part of our story. And I think so many women feel like they leave quietly. They're 1 foot in, 1 foot out for so many years, and then they just stop showing up. And their story is so, so valuable and so potent. And so I would just encourage people to speak up and share that family of origin story, the or whatever you want to call it, the evolution of your faith, and your relationship with the Roman institution. I think it's incredibly powerful. And I really missed that in the synodal process because I felt like we're talking to everybody's included, but actually I really wanted to hear from women who have been or Catholic, former Catholics, or whatever you want to call that, who have been left for ordination in a different tradition or a different denomination. Because that to me is such a missing piece of our story of the women who, because it wasn't a silent decision for you, but when you stop showing up or whatever, we don't hear that story. So I would just say that that's an incredibly powerful tool, and we should create more spaces to listen to that journey, that story, and to not go silently and to not just, close the door. Although I'm sure for some people it's too painful, but I would love to create more space for those stories to be heard and to know that generally and forever all movement we're stronger together. And if there's any way that we can show up for one another and support one another in living out and embodying a renewed priestly ministry, I think that only benefits the church, the world, and our movement. So yeah, just we're stronger together.
Kate, since Reverend Trish dared to ask a question focused on women, I'm going to dare to ask a question focused on men. We are not half of the church and its population, but, and I apologize in advance if if there's if there are hints of privilege in this question, but for some crazy reason, men are judged worthy of something simply due to their chromosomes, the bodies into which they were born. My question for you becomes, how can male allies help to support the Women's Ordination Conference? Men throughout the church, men who are ordained, especially men who are ordained within the Roman Catholic Church, what can we do?
Well, thank you for that question too. So we have a member who will talk your ear off, but he talks about how he's been a member of the Miss Foundation for as long as it's been around, and his they always call for renewal, and they always address the mail to his wife, and he's like, "Well, she doesn't need to be a member of this group, I do." And similarly, he's a member of the Women's Ordination Conference, and so I think just being active and supportive allies financially, showing up, for witnesses or demonstrations. I think just including yourself in the movement. The weight of this injustice, it harms everyone. And so if we're working to heal the church, then we need everyone to be part of that healing. We need all people to step forward. And if there is a position of privilege that men have and their voices are carry and are listened to and are centered, and so using that opportunity to decenter themselves or to use their voice to recognize the often invisible work of women. So I would just implore people to, especially men or those who carry a lot of privilege, to use their voice, or opposite, decenter their voice and allow women to step forward. But certainly, men are members of the Women's Ordination Conference, and we welcome their membership and their support.
Mhm. And it's not to say in any way, shape, or form that the inclusive Catholic movement has left these issues behind. We have, you know, Roman Catholic bone marrow. I have my mentor who was part of the initial group in Chicago that was raising up the first what would become, walk, um, likes to say that Catholic is a blood type, and it's hard to change it. you know so we are grappling with these issues too. We're trying to figure out how, because many of us were formed in Roman Catholic seminaries or in Roman Catholic systems, or the truth is all you need is the neuro-linguistic programming of sitting in the pews your whole life where only men get to speak to the community, right? Or it operates on so many levels. So thank you for acknowledging the importance of the allyship of our men. It's just like when you say to white folks, you know what, racism's your issue. You don't need your neighbors of color to go fight this. This is your issue to undo, right? So, I was out marching in St. Paul yesterday with the Palm Sunday Path because Christian nationalism, that's our issue to undo. Christians, right? We're the Jews and the Buddhists and the indigenous folks and all that cannot speak to this moment the way Christians are going to have to speak to it. Um, so we're not there yet. And it makes me wonder if we have we need to recognize that as a movement and embrace the circles of conversation like the one you've created so powerfully. I can't believe it's been more than a decade, Kate. I really can't, but that you've created so powerfully for WALK. We're coming to that time where we begin to wrap up. And we like to have a moment where everybody gets a last word. And so I'm going to turn to
Oh,
Jayme and say, Jayme, what's your last word as we wrap up? And then, of course, as we always do, we'll give Kate really the ultimate last word.
awesome. Happily. I just want to say, Kate, what a delight to reconnect with you again. My acquaintance with the women's ordination movement, admittedly, when I was a seminarian reading the pages of the National Catholic Reporter and Commonweal Magazine, America, it was sort of like I had some knowledge of the Women's Ordination Conference, but no experience of it. And sadly, for the more than 10 years that I served as a priest within the Roman Catholic Church, I really had no connection to the Women's Ordination Conference. It was after I stepped out of the Roman Catholic Church and when we started Holy Family Catholic Church here in Austin, Austin's only inclusive community, that we had my predecessor on the school board, Diana Castañeda, who served in the seat that I would later hold. She started coming to Mass, and that intrigued me. But she said that she previously served on the board of the Women's Ordination Conference, and it created this real connection for me through Diana Castañeda, formerly of the Women's Ordination Conference board, to be connected to you all. And so what a delight now these years later, now with these fond memories of Diana coming to Mass at Holy Family, even in a wheelchair, even when she was struggling with respect to her health before she went, home to her eternal reward. It's a real delight now to have another connection to the Women's Ordination Conference. And I just want to pledge to you before we get off this call that as soon as we get off this podcast, I'm going to become a member of the Women's Ordination Conference myself. And I'd love to challenge all of our listeners, everyone who tunes into this podcast, to consider doing the same. This is something that we need to support for the sake of sacramental justice, for the sake of all of our sisters who are the majority of this church. All of us need to find a way, privately or more publicly, to support what it is that the Women's Ordination Conference is doing. And so, Kate, I bow my head in your direction to you and all of our friends in the Women's Ordination Conference. Y'all are extraordinary. I look forward to following your successes, but more importantly, as soon as we're done with this podcast, I look forward to becoming a member of the Women's Ordination Conference, seeing how I and so many of our listeners can help to lift up and to support the great work that y'all are doing. Reverend Trish, final words?
Well, that's exactly where my mind went. I was going to do the same thing. I'm going to be doing the same thing when I hang up. I had a membership for many years, and you cannot have a been there, done that on these issues. And I think back to, when I was a kid and we were first hearing that phrase, like, think globally, act locally. We're all acting locally. Everybody in this movement who's raising up and, this beautifully embedded Catholic community tradition that we have. But it's a bigger issue. And we have a debt to people all over the globe. And we have, on some level, someone like me, I have an obligation. I'm really present to that. To show up and to be there and to help you bring forward, our voices too. We do have things to say, and the body of Christ is diminished because, Reverend Rosa and Father Terry and Reverend Kate and all my amazing women colleagues. I have the most amazing women priest colleagues in the Ecumenical Catholic Communion. We're less because they're not in the conversation. So thanks, Kate, for jumping in and spending time with us because I think this is a very important message for our movement at this time. And I hope you see an uptick in membership. So what are your last words?
Well, thank you both so much. It's been so wonderful to chat with you, and thank you for your commitment to the movement. We are in our 50th anniversary year, and we only get to celebrate that because of people like you and in your communities who have labored long and supported the Women's Ordination Conference over 5 decades. My final word is that if people who are listening or watching are interested in finding more about the community or encountering the community, we are having a conference. We actually haven't had one in 10 years, so this could be a big one. So it's our 50th anniversary conference. We're going back to Detroit, where the movement began over Thanksgiving weekend, 1975. So we're going over Pentecost weekend, May 22nd through 24th, 2026. In Detroit. The website is walk50.org, and you can find out more there. All are welcome. You don't have to there's no requirements, everyone is welcomed. And it's especially in these times, it's finding your beloved community and people who are talking about these issues with integrity and action behind them. I think it just is so necessary. So all are invited and welcome to join us at that conference.
Wonderful. And we will put the websites in our little squib that goes with the podcast so that people can quickly click and join or register. 50th anniversary. I have a feeling there's going to be some joy there. Jayme, you want to close us out?
Yay on 50 years. Thank you, Kate McElwee, Executive Director of the Women's Ordination Conference. We can all learn more online at womensordination.org and also on social media. A big thank you as well to all of our listeners. Thank you for joining us for Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Father Jayme Matthias.
And I'm Reverend Trish Sullivan-Vani.
Let's advocate for our sisters.
Thank you for joining us for Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. Keep the faith.